Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Opportunity China's third pre-departure webinar for the Teach China Graduate Programme 2020 February intake. Thank you very much, those of you who have joined us once again today. It's great to have you here. The webinar today, we're going to be looking at life outside of work. So we're going to be taking a look at all things China outside of your workplace and outside of teaching in the country. We're going to be taking a brief look over an introduction of modern Chinese history and the context and importance that that has when dealing with day-to-day life in China. We'll also be taking a look at cross-cultural understanding and going over some of the core cultural concepts that are vital to understanding China when you go out there to live and work. We'll be taking a look at the Great Firewall of China and some really useful apps and social media that will help you along on your China journey. We'll also be taking a look at transport and getting around China, what options are going to be open to you, and a recommendation on which ones will be best to use. We're also going to take a look at leisure and entertainment, so what you can fill your free time doing whilst living and working in China. Remember that you can ask any questions you like at any time during this webinar. Just pop them in the chat box on the right hand side. An Opportunity China coordinator is there to answer any questions as we go along, but I will be stopping, as always, after each section to address any questions that have come up in the chat box whatsoever. Don't be afraid if your question isn't relevant or related to the particular subject we're talking about. We will endeavour to go through those. And as we're going through this, if you have anything to ask at all, we will be having a question and answer session at the end of this session too. Let's take a look first of all at a brief historic overview of China. Now, saying a brief historical overview of China is pretty tricky territory to get into, as China does have 5,000 years of history and continuous civilization. And for much of that history, the country has been composed of dynasties and commonly divided into multiple kingdoms, with brief but very well celebrated periods of total unification, of a greater China, in the olden times the greater Ming dynasty, the greater Yuan dynasty, or currently the unified People's Republic of China. This history of division, this history of warring, means that being a united, sole, cohesive force is incredibly important for China and incredibly important for its people. And that sense of stability and unitedness and coming together is a theme that runs through Chinese society today and has followed through from those ancient times. In 1912, the country became the Republic of China. And for the very first time, it ceased to be a kingdom, it ceased to be a dynasty or an empire, and became a republic following the Xinhai Revolution. And from 1927 until 1950, fractures began to show within the Republic of China, and a very bloody civil war broke out between communists and nationalists with competing views of how China and how the Republic should exist, be it a capitalist, republic, liberal, but still largely authoritarian state, or a communist state under Mao. In 1949, the People's Republic of China declared itself as the real China, and the nationalist government fled to its last outpost in Taiwan. Now, I won't go desperately into the one China principle, but suffice to say, when you see that Taiwan isn't classified in and of itself as a country, this is largely because both Taiwan and the broader People's Republic of China have an agreement to recognize that there is only one China, and each China exists in a kind of continued state of limbo, claiming to be the one China. Each country in the world can only recognize one. So the official name of Taiwan is actually the Republic of China. And the People's Republic of China is the country that is recognized by most countries in the world. It's important to state, again, historically, this is quite a sensitive issue in China. if you're talking about countries with people, if you say, oh, a country like Taiwan that's different to China, this can sometimes be a little bit of a sensitive issue when speaking with Chinese friends, as Chinese believe that Taiwan is a province of China, and it's a simple matter of fact. So a lot of these complex historical points can sometimes lead to some quite awkward misunderstandings in China. Now, after the formation of the People's Republic of China in 1949, much of the 20th century was defined as a century of struggle, hardship, and indeed terror for many people living in the earlier years, or I say earlier years broadly, the first 30 years of the People's Republic of China's existence. From 1927 to 1950, the Civil War cost the lives of around 8 million people in the country. Between 1937 and 1945, the Sino-Japanese War, part of World War II, left around 22 million civilians dead. From 1958 until 1962, Mao's Great Leap Forward and agricultural reform resulting in the Great Famine left somewhere between 15 to 52 million people dead. Between 1966 and 1976, the Cultural Revolution left between hundreds of thousands to 20 million people dead, many more people persecuted, many more people forced to flee China, go into exile, and much of China's history, including artifacts, thought, academic thinking, was destroyed, wiped out in an attempt to go back to a year zero and rebuild the country in a pure communist way. Now, the Cultural Revolution and the catastrophes that preceded it were combined with a self-imposed isolation of the country, with very few people leaving and even fewer coming in. China was very much a hermit republic for much of the early history of the People's Republic. This goes a long way to coming to terms with, again, how exciting and sometimes curious it can be for this new China, particularly for the older generations, to actually have foreigners living and working in the country, when in the not too distant past, this was something that seemed like a total impossibility. Now, following this period, there came a long period, which is still going on today, called opening up and reform in China. Deng Xiaoping, you can see his picture there in the bottom left, and one just underneath where he's actually sitting with Margaret Thatcher, ascended to become paramount leader of China upon Mao's death in 1976. Although Deng himself actually never held any official great offices of state, through political maneuvering and through a wide consensus, Deng was the paramount leader. He represented China. He was the de facto head of state for the country. A process of reform and opening up began in 1978 in China, again de facto in 1978, but de jure in 1979 with the formation of the first special economic zone in Shenzhen. Economic and social consequences of this process of reform and opening up were significant, not least economically, broadly through China becoming a manufacturing hegemon in the world, becoming what was known as the workhouse or the warehouse or the manufacturing base of the world for a very long time. But during this time, reform began when it came to social and political structures, not going back to the pre-People's Republic time, but also righting some of the wrongs and self-recognised wrongs of the Cultural Revolution to improve things such as education, to bring about greater welfare and freedom of opportunity, as well as choice among the population, who throughout the early years of the People's Republic were pigeonholed into doing certain roles, given very little freedom, and taught and encouraged to live much of an agrarian kind of worker peasant's lifestyle. China today, of course, is a very different country, all but unrecognizable from those days of the Cultural Revolution. It is a confident and prosperous country, a country where freedom of opportunity that's been unseen from 30 years ago exists within the younger generation. There is an energy, enthusiasm, and a positivity that exists in China, particularly among the younger generation, when it comes to making something of their lives, when it comes to being creative and having an ingenious sense of adventure in what they can achieve through their careers and what they can bring to their country. There are over 160 million cities with populations in excess of 1 million people. The world's largest migration in history has happened in China over the last 30 years from the countryside to the cities, with a mass sprawl of urbanization leading to a considerably larger middle class in the country, lifting 800 million people out of poverty and almost eradicating total poverty in itself. Innovating, as opposed to just making and manufacturing, is now one of the biggest incentives for companies and for the state in China. There's a huge amount of investment in leading in areas such as artificial intelligence, becoming a country that specializes in research and innovation. China is very much changing its face from being that manufacturing base to being an innovative global leader. There is also a renaissance in traditional Chinese culture, much of which was voluntarily destroyed and given up during the Cultural Revolution. You'll often find a lot of Chinese buying back many artifacts that were smuggled out of the country during the Cultural Revolution, and this middle class wanting to reassert traditional Chinese values in Confucianism, education, as we discussed yesterday, as well as celebrating things like traditional Chinese dress, traditional buildings, Chinese opera. There's a huge amount of traditional Chinese culture that's coming back and being celebrated now. So for a chance to see some of those more interesting elements of that 5,000 years of civilization and culture, there's never a better time to go and visit China than now, when the enthusiasm is quite so large. China has also become a global-facing and internationally minded country, a country where people are curious and want to know more and more about other people's countries, cultures, environments, in order to try and get ahead in that global world. All of this links into that kind of positivity that's existing in China, that grew and rose like a phoenix from the ashes of the Cultural Revolution. But with all of this positivity and optimism, there do come some very hard truths that need to be accepted about China. And I certainly won't wash over China and say it's a wonderful, positive, optimistic place where absolutely nothing happens, or there's absolutely nothing that is potentially disagreeable to people with Western values and Western mindsets. There's an enormous emphasis on stability and authority in China. This does very strongly leak back historically to a disunited country, a country that had been chopped up and carved to pieces by the colonial powers as well in many cities. And because of that emphasis on stability and authority, there are certain freedoms that are enjoyed in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom that simply aren't in China. There's no freedom of the press, no freedom of assembly. Wounds are still sore from a tragic past, and sensitivity among the general population is very much on a national scale. China in itself doesn't have quite the sense of humour that countries like Britain and America have, where we can poke fun at ourselves and poke fun at each other. There's a lot more sensitive sore spots that exist in China, not least to do with that very tragic and very sore, freshly sore past that exists. Discussion of politics in China, again, is simply not the norm. China is not a democracy. China is not a liberal democracy like the United States and the United Kingdom. The government is a government run for the people, not necessarily of the people in the traditional sense that we have, and has a very different political system insofar as that is concerned. Independent outlook. China has a collective independent outlook, which means they are very sensitive as a country and as a nation to criticism from outside forces, particularly outside forces that are perceived to have not helped during times where they were struggling. And this does feed down to the general population. So it's important to be very careful when making any kind of criticism of the country in China. I've learned this lesson quite a few times. It certainly won't get you into legal trouble or get you arrested or anything, but you need to be aware sometimes of something you might say in Britain to a British person, or in America to an American person, which would just be very blasé, but to a Chinese person might seem quite offensive. Now, does anyone have any questions on our brief historical overview of China, or on any of those hard truths that we went over, on any points there? Okay, not a problem. Remember, pop any questions you have in the box and we will answer them. So let's move on now to look at a few core cultural concepts that exist in China. Now, these core cultural concepts are quite nuanced, and there certainly is no objective rule to understanding them immediately and straight off the bat. There are going to be awkward situations, but in order to get a grounding and understanding sometimes of what behavior is happening and why that behavior is happening, there are two very core cultural concepts that are important to understand. The first is mianzi, or the concept of face. Now, this is vital to understanding the nature of relationships in China and appropriate discourse when it comes to general discussion, but particularly in a formal or professional environment. Now, the concept of face might seem simple at first, but it actually has a lot of subtle nuances. And it's very important to remember to at all times be thinking about face, to be thinking about what you're saying, where you're saying it, and whether or not you are causing inadvertently somebody to lose face through something that you might think is just a slight criticism, or you might think is just a comment, but could be interpreted otherwise in a public setting. The most important thing is to remember to both have face and to give face. To have face, to behave in a harmonious manner, to ensure that when you are in a public setting, you do not become over emotional or show a huge amount of anger or frustration to someone within a formal context or a formal setting. It's equally important as well to give face, to make sure that there is a sense of deference shown to figures of authority. Again, when you're at an important occasion, say like a banquet with a boss or a figure of authority at that point, and ensure that neither yourself nor anyone in your company lose face. And so make sure your actions that you take or you use are always making sure face is retained. So if, say, a figure of authority or a friend or someone is late to a meeting, even if you might be very frustrated, don't call them out on it in front of other people. Maybe have a word with them when they get back. In China, often it looks like things are being let go within public or formal settings, but actually a lot of the time it's simply a matter of saving face for a person and for yourself and retaining a level of social harmony. Retaining that equilibrium of social harmony is very, very important in China, and always thinking about face first will ensure that you help retain that. Of course, as a foreigner, there is a huge amount of leeway that is given to us, very thankfully, as I have been very guilty of inadvertently not showing face or losing face or accidentally not giving face when I should have done. Now, there is another cultural concept that's very important, which is the concept of guanxi. Now, guanxi literally means relations or relationships in China. In China, relationships and networks work very differently to in a country like the UK or the United States, where you may have a professional and a personal relationship that sometimes might overlap, but are broadly very separate. As Margaret Thatcher once said, there's no such thing as society, only individuals and their family. Now, I don't necessarily believe this is true of the West. I do think there is a society in the West, but the society that exists in the West is certainly nowhere near as interlinked or as complex as in China. In China, if you know someone, chances are they will know several other people that you know who are seemingly unrelated. And a lot of this has to do with the homogeneity of China as a country and as a whole. As a communitarian country, these relationships are key. Few people rely just on themselves and a small circle of friends, acquaintances, and business partners, as exists in the West. And this will affect you because you'll find a lot of invites and gifts through the culture of Guanxi and people wanting to expand their relationships and networks. So be prepared for people to be quite full on and expressing to want to make friendships and want to gain deeper contacts in areas. And there's a lot of quid pro quo that exists when it comes to Guanxi. A lot of favors for favors of people feeling a responsibility to do something for someone, but having an expectation to receive something back. So be very cautious sometimes of hospitality that's being offered for you, because there may very well be an expectation of having something received in return. Trust within relationships is enormously important, and breaking trust is very much seen as a sign of a loss of faith. So before you enter into these social contracts of Guanxi, before you accept hospitality, before you accept someone's help for doing something, think about whether or not you can actually return a favor for this person, or what this person might want to get back from you, and whether that relationship is going to be really valuable for you, and whether or not you may end up inadvertently breaking trust with a particular person. Now, the concept of face is intrinsically linked to mianzi. So when you're dealing with Guanxi, you have got to remember to think of face as well. So if someone wants to invite you for dinner, remember to show face by being deferent and refusing a couple of times before eventually going. If they continue to proceed, you may want to show them face by going with them. But if this person is interested in an area or seems like they want something from you from a Guanxi perspective that you don't think you're going to be able to deliver, then it's important to make sure you let them down and maybe don't go down the path of building that Guanxi and building that trust, but doing so very gently, very discreetly, and very diplomatically with them in order to save face in the country. Now, when it comes to social, business, and political discourse in the country, relationships, agreements that are sought and bought into, relationships often take priority over all other forms of agreement, to the extent that mediation in China is the single largest industry that exists in the legal firm. Mediation is pretty much everything, even to the extent where if there is disruption or if there is a crime or a fight that's committed in China, very often the police will take the two people who were having the dispute to an initial tea drinking situation where they'll sit, they'll discuss with each other terms upon which they can settle and mediate a dispute before going to court. And a lot of this is because of relationships being so important and not wanting to damage relationships between people who are either friends or people who are in a dispute with one another. It's important always to retain face, retain social harmony, and retain relationships in China. Now, when it comes to culture in China, you can't underestimate the importance of dining and the importance of food in the country. Dining is the most important cultural environment in the country. It'll commonly be used as part of introducing and beginning a relationship and beginning that introduction to Guanxi. In China, eating with people is incredibly important, as it's a place where you get to know a stranger, where you get to know someone. Places where you eat are often incredibly loud. You'll very often have tables full of people. They're not desperately intimate environments, and to the extent in which they're often gauged on their quality by the amount of noise as opposed to the lack of noise, where the fancy ambient Western restaurants take a lot of their pride from. Seating arrangements in China are often important to think of when dining. A figure of authority always sits facing the door so they can welcome each individual in. So remembering not to take that seat that's facing the door when you go and sit, especially if you're sitting and dining with someone who's a figure of authority. Ganbeiing, or clearing your glass, is a very important part of dining, and again, an important part of culture in China. You can see just in the middle picture here, everybody ganbeiing into the middle. Cheersing and drinking with people is very important. Very often in China, before you speak with someone or before you eat, you'll have to drink with them in order to do so. So you might turn to a person with you and cheers them before you drink. In China, there's a social cue where you actually can't drink your drink until you cheers with someone, until you join someone in drinking. And again, that shows that kind of communitarian, homogenous, the idea of the whole being greater than the individual level of society that exists in China. And when you're toasting, when you're ganbeiing and clearing your glass, remember to toast lower down on a figure of authority. It can almost be quite amusing sometimes seeing a huge group of people trying to get as low as they possibly can to each other's glasses and almost fighting over who is more deferent to the other person, who is showing more face to the other person. Now, in China, there are 8 great regional cuisines. There's the spicy foods of Sichuan and Hunan. You have the light, sweet foods that are most prominent in Guangdong, in Canton, which we're most used to in the West, with the majority of Western restaurants being a kind of bastardized, westernized style of Cantonese or Guangdong food. You also have a quite similar sweet food in Zhejiang and around Shanghai, where there's also a bit of a speciality in very, very tasty dumplings. You also have a very wild mountainous form of food that's found in Anhui and Fujian, where a lot of agriculture exists. A lot of rice-based dishes, a lot of corn-based dishes there as well. When it comes to seafood, the most prominent and great cuisine that exists in China is the food in Shandong, from areas like Jinan and Qingdao, where you get a lot of the freshest seafood in China. Shellfish is a particular speciality from these areas. Now, if you're not living in any of these areas of the 8 great regional cuisines, don't worry, you can try restaurants with all of them. In China, in every single city where you go to, there will be restaurants that specialize in each of these types of cuisines and types of food. So being aware of what type of food you like before you go. Very often in China, you'll be asked what type of food you want. Doing a little bit of research on these 8 great cuisines is very, very advisable, as it'll help you from going, oh, I don't mind, or oh, I don't know, and actually really help people along the way in terms of choosing where you want to go. Now, does anyone have any questions on those core elements of cultural understanding? Okay, great. Well, let's move on. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in there. Let's talk a little bit about transport in China. Getting around China is an incredibly important part of living there, and it may seem intimidating at first to be going to a country where you don't speak the language, might not necessarily know how to go about getting a travel card or paying for things when it comes to traveling. So let's go over what some of the options are, what some of the things that exist in China are in terms of transportation systems. Well, within your city, the cheapest mode of transportation is generally a bus. Speaking with your HR representative or manager, they will help you find a bus route from your apartment to work and also a bus route from your apartment to the centre of the city. These are often very easy to memorize, and you'll be able to either get a card, a travel card that you can top up very easily at metro system machines or via WeChat, or simply use WeChat and get an online travel card for your city, which you can find in English, to beep against the contactless points on each of the buses. Alternatively, you can just have some change with you and use them to pop in when you get on the bus because all journeys are standardized at a price within the cities of between 1 and 2 renminbi. This is still the case for pretty much all cities in China. It is the most cheap and simple mode of transportation that you can take. Then, of course, there are the metros that exist in the vast majority of Tier 1, Tier 2, and even a large number of Tier 3 cities in China. These are broadly between 2 and 6 renminbi per journey, or around 25 to 70 pence. It very much depends on how far you're going with this, but it is significantly cheaper than taking any kind of underground system in the United Kingdom or the United States. These are all also very new state-of-the-art systems, but they can get incredibly busy at peak times, so do be prepared for a very large squeeze. Again, like with the buses, you can use either a top-up card that you can get at any subway, or in a lot of places in an HR representative will be able to help you get one of those, or you can use an online card via WeChat just to beep in using the contactless pay points and the barriers at metro services. You can also get a taxi, you can hail one down. You'll see them all over the place still in pretty much all first, second and third tier cities. The starting meters generally begin between 6 and 15 renminbi depending on where you are in the country, 15 being the highest in places like Shanghai, 6 being the lowest in places that are a fair bit cheaper in second or third tier cities. You will usually pay only a couple of kwai on top of that starting fee for a journey of about 10 to 20 minutes at a busy time. Didi are often cheaper, and I'll be speaking about Didi as an app to use. It's essentially the Chinese version of Uber, and again, it has all English language versions, and you can even contact the driver and it'll automatically translate what you're saying to him. You also have the option of using a bike rental. You'll find these all around first and second tier cities in China. You'll be able to use WeChat to scan a barcode and automatically pay out from your bank account, which will be linked up to your phone to rent a bike. It's free for the first hour and then 1 renminbi for each subsequent hour after that. When exploring China and taking those more long-distant modes of transport, there are quite a few options. First of all, you've got high-speed rail. Again, in all major Chinese cities, you are going to have at least one quite large railway station, which will have a high-speed rail link to the major cities of China from it. To give you an idea of how fast these go, these trains can reach up to around 200 miles per hour and can get you between Beijing and Shanghai in around 4 hours and 48 minutes. Sleeper trains are a cheaper alternative that can be used. These are often around a quarter to a sixth of the price of a high-speed rail train, but do take significantly longer. You can also get internal flights quite cheap in China, as there's a much lower tax on internal flights to external flights within the country. Most importantly, what I would say is always remember to ask a Chinese friend to help you book on the Chinese language version of C-Trip. Now, C-Trip, or Trip as it's called in the English language version, you can book flights, you can book internal trains in China, you can use it to book pretty much anything and go and collect your tickets. But it is worth asking a Chinese friend to use the Chinese language version, as you will find on the Chinese language version that pretty much all modes of transportation and tickets are significantly cheaper than using an English language version. Now, any questions on transport in China? I see we've got a question just here. Do you have any advice on how you order in a restaurant in China? Also, when traveling, is it best to learn Chinese to get around? That's a really, really good question. So if you are out with a group of Chinese friends, you'll pretty much always find that your Chinese friends want to order for you. If you're out with a group of Western friends, it's a really good chance for you to practice some of your Chinese ability. Now, the majority of restaurants in China, in fact, almost all restaurants in China, will have very large pictures of the food in the menus that they are showing you. So having a waiter or a waitress come over, simply point to the food that you want. And if you're very new to China, you can simply use the word 这个 or 我要这个, which means I want that one, and that'll be absolutely fine. Now, when you're learning Chinese and when you're getting your lessons, it's important as one of the first things that you ask your teacher to want to learn to practice food, because this is really the best time to practice speaking with people in China, with waiters. So practice learning what your favorite food type is and asking, how can I order this? If you have an allergy, make sure that you ask a friend or a colleague at work to print out a little bit of paper that says in Chinese, I'm allergic to this. Does this have something in it when you're at a restaurant? And the second part of that, also when traveling, is it best to learn Chinese to get around? Yes, absolutely. Once again, it's very, very good to learn Chinese in order to get around. But when you're first arriving, don't feel intimidated if you don't know any at all. If you book a train on C-Trip, for instance, you'll need to go to a window at the train station to collect your tickets once you've booked them. You simply just need to present them with your passport and a code number that you have. You don't need to say anything or to explain anything at that point. And a lot of online work irons out some of the more difficulties when it comes to asking questions when traveling in China. Again, at restaurants, something that's becoming more and more familiar is when you go into a restaurant, you'll find a lot will have on the table a barcode that you can scan using your WeChat. Once you scan that, you'll find that a menu actually pops up on your phone where you can order what food you want to your table directly from your phone, meaning you don't actually even need to speak with the waiter or waitress. However, I find this is very much a wasted opportunity for practicing language skills. So remember when you're having your lessons to ask your teacher about food and ask your teacher to practice some of your favourite food types and role play learning to speak in a restaurant, as this really is a great opportunity to practice your language skills. Let's take a look now at going online in China. And let's cover first of all the elephant in the room, which is the Great Firewall. So the Great Firewall exists because China operates a very tight level of internet security and what it calls internet sovereignty. Lots of popular Western websites such as YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Google, which includes everything like Gmail, anything you want to use for Google at all, are all blocked in China on the standard internet. You'll need to use a VPN in order to access these websites. We have a really good VPN guide on our website and we'll send out information on that to you. Make sure you download and install it before you arrive in China. We do recommend using ExpressVPN as it has proven to be the most reliable VPN for China in terms of its updates. Remember to continue updating your VPN with any and all updates that come in, as if you miss one, the government may find a particular proxy or a particular VPN location and decide to cut it off. So make sure you keep up to date and open all of the emails that you receive from your VPN provider whilst you're out there. Even when using sites that are blocked in China, such as Facebook and Twitter, it's important to be discreet about what you post. Again, being careful about posting things that are very critical or things that might be sensitive is very strongly advised. Now, China does have a large amount of alternative social media that's utilized in the country. WeChat is an absolute necessity in China. You'll be using it absolutely all the time as an instant messaging service, but also for things like ordering food, paying bills, paying other people. If you owe a friend some money, often you'll just use WeChat to pop that across to them and have that in their account. You can use it to scan and pay for pretty much anything in the country. You can even give money to people who are busking or beggars in China via WeChat QR codes. There are also several other forms of social media that act in a very similar way to Western social media. You have Weibo, which is essentially the Chinese microblogging website and their version of Twitter. You have QQ, which is popularly used as an email service. I actually use QQ very often as a personal email service because you can attach and transfer really, really large files to single emails. It's really actually a very great email service to use once you're there. Youko Tudor, which is essentially a Chinese version of YouTube. You can find a huge amount of Western videos on there and Western films on there as well that you can access for free. Again, it's a really good website to actually use in general, let alone in China. You've got Dianping, which is essentially a Chinese version of Yelp, where you can get a lot of information on restaurants that you might be going to. And then you've also got Douban, which is pretty much the Chinese version of Spotify. Now, when it comes to apps that are going to be really useful to use in China, I'll give you a little bit of a rundown of a few of them. So Alipay is a great app. You can use it to pay for anything, anywhere. Alipay works a little bit similar to WeChat Pay, where you can transfer money from your bank in China directly to Alipay and use it as a service to scan and pay for things directly, or use its services to pay for things like food deliveries, electricity bills, anything you can think of. You've also got Taobao, which is pretty much the Amazon of China, but quicker and better. You can ask a Chinese friend or colleague to input your delivery address, your address in Chinese, onto Taobao, and then use Alipay connected to it to pay for and have delivered just about anything you want in the world. Now, Taobao delivery is often considerably quicker than Amazon. A lot of the time you'll get same-day delivery for a lot of products. Sometimes they'll arrive in under an hour if you're in a city where that particular product is being manufactured. You've got Baidu Translate, which is the best app for translating in China. If your VPN is down and you've not got Google Translate, I actually think in terms of a app that translates better and faster and uses a spoken feature much better, Baidu Translate is actually superior to Google Translate now. You've also got Baidu Maps, which is the best map service to use for getting around. Again, its interface works in a very similar way to Google Maps, but it's considerably more accurate, and it's also a lot better for seeing what's around you as well. Apple Maps is another alternative that you can use, but I find that it's actually not as user-friendly as Baidu Maps is now. Didi is a vital app to use in China. Again, your Chinese HR representative will help you get a Didi set up and have that linked to your Alipay or to your bank account directly. You'll be able to use that to hail a cab or to hail a Didi driver pretty much anywhere. You can select on it if you want a basic Didi, if you want an executive kind, or you can actually use a taxi option where it will only hail down registered taxi drivers within the city. It often works out a little bit cheaper than hailing a taxi and paying the normal fare as well. And you can also use a Didi to arrange to have much longer trips. You've got Meituan and Ele.me, which are the Chinese food delivery apps and services. One of the first things that you'll see when you arrive in China are little armies of people on mopeds dressed in blue or dressed in yellow who are delivery drivers for Ele.me and Meituan. Each city has a different one that's kind of dominant. So some of you will be using Ele.me and some of you will be using Meituan throughout your time in China, depending on the city where you're going to be. But these food delivery services deliver from every single restaurant in your city, guaranteed. From fast food Western restaurants to your favorite Chinese restaurant. You can use it and look at the reviews and see star ratings of places where you want to order from. And again, have a Chinese friend, colleague, or HR representative put in your address in Chinese to make sure that it comes to you correctly. Does anyone have any questions on using the internet or on any of those apps and applications in China? Okay, once again, we will move on, but please do feel free to pop any questions that you might have in the box, and I'll be more than happy to answer those. Let's talk a little bit about leisure activities in China, what you can do in your spare time, what's going to be available for you. Well, restaurants are far and away the most popular destination for both Chinese and expats to socialise, for a lot of the reasons that we've covered earlier in the webinar. In second tier and first tier cities, there's often a very good mix of Chinese and modern Western restaurants. Chinese restaurants will be no problem to find whatsoever, and you'll have your absolute fill of those. But when it comes to Western restaurants, you'll often find that there are small Western communities that exist of bars and restaurants. They're very often located close to any Western embassies or Western consulates. Foreign consulates in Chinese cities are often pretty much all located around the same space. For Western ones, they'll often be in the same compound in second tier cities. And in first tier cities, you'll often find these areas located in pretty central places that are very easy to get to. Western restaurants and these Western bar areas are very simple to find and will become a very popular hub spot for foreigners in the country. Developed cities with expat populations will have numerous ones of these, and you'll also find that there are an abundance of malls that have cinemas, bowling alleys, fencing clubs, anything that you can wish for. It's very important that you go and have a little bit of an explore in your local area and use WeChat groups with people to find this. There's also a boom in fitness and health currently in China, with gyms often located in malls and located in large high street shopping areas that are easy to reach via public transport. What I'd recommend more than anything when it comes to finding where to go and what to do are to get yourself invited via your friends to as many WeChat groups as possible. You'll find that people in China, as they're all in the same boat, will be more than happy to help if you want to start up a sports club. You can see at the top there, that's actually a Gaelic football club made up of foreigners that exists in Shenzhen. So you'll find very quickly that even if you think a sport or an activity that you enjoy is quite niche, a lot of people will be very enthusiastic to join and try to make what you want happen. So keeping up to date, being involved in expat groups is incredibly important, and finding those little hubs of Western bars and restaurants will help you settle in during your first times in China. Does anyone have any questions on leisure time activities in China and sort of expat spots? Okay, again, happy to answer any questions at the end. Our webinar tomorrow, our final webinar this week, will be on making the most of your China experience, where we're going to be speaking a little bit more about what opportunities might await you at the end of your time teaching in China, how best to sell yourself and sell your China experience to any future employers that you might have. And also we'll be taking a look at some alumni of the Teach China graduate program and some other China teachers that we've had who have moved on and gone into all kinds of other interesting and exciting areas once they've finished teaching. But before we finish today, does anybody have any final questions? Okay. In which case, thank you very much for joining us again today. Hope to see you again tomorrow. As always, if you do have any questions at all, do feel free to put them to your Opportunity China coordinator, and they'll be more than happy to answer for you. But for now, thank you very much once again for joining us, and goodbye.